Amidst the gloom of the dark forest, illuminated by the blood moon, someone's thoughts were heard. They were the thoughts of a girl who was asking someone named Etienne if he had ever heard of the hellbird. It was a bird from a book her grandmother had read to her as a child. It has a coal-black body like a crow, and blood-red eyes. And if you look into those eyes, this bird will steal your soul. Returning to reality and standing in the middle of the hall of a large mansion, the girl thought that maybe this was the whole point. Perhaps the very moment she made eye contact with this guy, he stole her soul? This story took place in the modest and desolate territories of the Regwell region in the north, in a mansion located on top of a hill. When one day there was a small commotion there, a young girl excitedly told the maid that her father would be arriving soon, so they had to hurry. The maid calmed the young lady down and said that she would make her so beautiful that she would have no equal in the whole world. The girl was sitting on a chair, holding a book in her hands, and shyly said that it would not be enough. After all, her father travels all over the world, so she should be the first in the whole white world. And the lady stopped at these words because she was so ashamed that she was breathless. The maid laughed. The girl with the red face asked why she was laughing. The woman apologized and explained that she just couldn't stop admiring the young lady, because not long ago she was such a baby, and now she has become a grown-up lady. The maid also asked if the lady was really that happy to see the Count return. The girl smiled gently and replied that it was true. After all, her father had promised that he would come back today with a gift. She began to think with excitement about what that gift might be. Maybe a new dress, but books would be better. Does her father know what she likes? This was the thought of a beautiful girl with long brown hair and blue eyes, the daughter of Count Eugene, Ioana Eugenia. Ioana quietly added that she didn't really like dressing up, but she always wanted to be beautiful in front of her father. After all, then he might look at her, even if only for a minute, right? The maid continued to comb the young lady's hair and said that she had nothing to worry about. She assured her that her mistress was the most beautiful person she had ever met. Joanna smiled. The maid replied that she was not joking and even swore by the name of Saint Diana. Moreover, the maid said that her biggest concern was that one day some marquis from a neighboring state, or perhaps a prince, would take her as his wife and take her away somewhere far, far away. Ioana blushed and asked how she could be talking about such a thing, since she was only 16. She hadn't even made her debut among the nobility yet, so what kind of marriage could we talk about? Besides, the nobility is not interested in rural aristocrats like her. The maid named Masa was very surprised and reminded the lady that she should be proud to bear the name of Count Eugene. At this point, they were interrupted. Another servant announced that the Count's carriage was on the horizon. Ioana jumped up from her seat, dropping her book. She was shocked that her father was already here. Running along the corridor of the mansion with her maid Masa, the girl stopped for a moment at the window and looked at her reflection. She abruptly turned to the woman and asked her what she looked like. Masa noted that the young lady had asked her this 10 times already, and she wondered if the owner thought she was deceiving her. Ioana replied that Masa was saying that because they were friends and asked her not to do that anymore. The maid looked at the lady in surprise. She said that she was her mistress first and foremost. The maid's surprise turned to a gentle smile, and she replied that it was true, that Ioana was indeed the owner of not only her, but of the whole of Ragwell. Ioana was stunned by these words. The maid held out her hand and explained that this was why the gentleman had no reason to worry. She suggested that the bewildered Ioana meet the Count with her head held high. Masa also asked if the young lady had forgotten about the wonderful gift that awaited her. Relieved, Ioana smiled and replied that she had not forgotten. A few minutes later, cold eyes drilled into Ioana. A tall young man with blue eyes and light blonde hair, dressed in a smart outfit and with a disgruntled face, stood in front of the girl. Ioana also looked at her husband and remained silent. She was puzzled and did not expect such a meeting. They looked at each other, and a heavy silence hung over the room. My husband was the first to break this awkwardness. He asked with contempt, "What's going on here? Is this the way to greet an older brother?" And then he added that the girl gave him a headache. This young man was Eli Eugenie, also the son and deputy of Count Eugenie. Frightened, Iona apologized to her brother for this misunderstanding, because she simply did not expect to see him. Eli pointed out that it was his house too. So shouldn't she be aware of the presence of the owner of the house? He also pointed out that the girl could not come up with a better excuse. John apologized again. A maid was watching this scene. Mentally, she noted that it was actually the young master himself who stayed late in the playhouses and rarely came here. Elijah looked angrily at the maid and then turned his gaze back to Joanna. He asked her what was the mess on her head, that no one would take someone like her as a wife. These words hurt the girl, and Eli continued to be rude. He apologized for her inappropriate attire and advised her sister to confess to her father that she had simply overslept and did not have time to prepare for his arrival. John was in despair. His brother's words were cruel, hurtful, and unjust. After all, she woke up 2 hours earlier than usual today just to get ready. Masa even washed her hair with fragrant oils. She wondered why her brother was always angry with her. Every time she spoke to him, she could not stop the trembling that spread throughout her body. While Elijah was reprimanding John, another voice came into the room and asked if he was the one they were meeting, and if it would be better to wait in the living room, because it was quite cold here in the hall. Ioana's eyes lit up. Just as she was about to greet her father, Eli interrupted her. He stood in front of the girl with his back completely to her and respectfully greeted her father on his return home. He also asked if his work in the capital had gone well. Elijah smiled gently at his father, and his expression was one of joy. Ioana, on the other hand, stood timidly aside and did not dare to do anything. Then she pulled herself together and called out loudly to her father and approached him. She made an elegant curtsy and also congratulated the Count on his return home safe and sound. Then the girl stood with her eyes down and trembling with fear. Twain Eugene, a.k.a. Count Eugene, a tall, thin man in his 50s, with the same blue eyes as Eli's, light blonde hair and a mustache. He looked at Ioan for a few seconds, and then, taking a drag of his cigar, he replied that it was true and asked the children to give him a break. After all, the hours of shaking in the crew had tired him out. The Count asked if anything had happened during his absence. Eli proudly declared that while he was here, the Count had nothing to worry about. While Eli was talking to his father, Ioana stood aside. She was panicking and trying to think of something to do. After all, she had not been able to talk to her father properly again. Moreover, Masa had warned her not to be nervous, but it was because of her excitement that she had ruined everything again. She wondered why it always happens to her. Perhaps that's why people treat her like a ghost. Suddenly, in the middle of the conversation, Count Eugenia turned to his servant Joseph and asked him to bring someone. The Count added that from now on, this person would be living with them, so he needed to introduce him. Eli frowned. He cautiously asked his father what he was talking about and who was going to live with them. The Count asked Eli in return whether he had forgotten that his father had promised to bring them a gift. Ioana's heart skipped a beat. Did the long-awaited word gift still run through his mind? It was hard for her to believe that her father remembered his promise. She closed her eyes in anticipation. Suddenly, Joseph, the servant, ordered someone very loudly and rudely to move forward and enter the house. Ioana turned her head toward the main entrance, and the girl froze. In front of her, she saw a guy in worn, dirty old clothes. Joanna looked at the unexpected guest and could not understand who he was. In addition to being covered in rags, he also had quite a few abrasions and bruises. Looking at the boy, Ioana noticed a strange mark on his arm. The girl was shocked when she realized that it was the mark of a slave of the Caspian Empire. Looking at the young man's dirty and battered face, the young lady could not believe that her father had brought home a slave. And then, the girl met the blood-red eyes that looked at her so piercingly. Ioana abruptly turned away from the boy, noting to herself that the boy's eyes were the color of blood. She found it very creepy, and at the same moment, a question flashed through her mind. Does the hellbird she had read about as a child have the same eyes? Eli, covering his nose in disgust, said that their guest smelled very bad, that even if he bathed in a sewer ditch, it would not be so overpowering. The man asked his father what all this meant. With a serene expression on his face, Count Eugenia replied that the young man would wash himself and be as good as new, especially since he has a keen eye for people. In fact, the Count thought it was a great idea. After all, Eli has always wanted a younger brother, and Ioana needs a companion her own age. Therefore, the Count hopes that his children will find a common language with the new resident of the estate. While the Count was explaining his idea, the stranger kept looking at Ioana with his blood-red eyes. She couldn't understand what was wrong with this guy. Why hadn't he taken his eyes off her since he entered the mansion? She could not believe that this was her gift. The disappointed young lady turned around and walked away, thinking that all her hopes had been in vain. Count Eugenia ordered the maid Maja to bathe the young man and cover his body with them, because today was his first day. The maid understood the order. Taking the boy by the arms and holding his nose against the stench, the maid whispered quietly that she was not sure if she could handle him until dinner. As they went in different directions, Ioana did not know that the ragged boy with blood-red eyes was the worst, and at the same time, the best gift that was given to her in her entire life. The girl recalled that since childhood, her father had never looked her in the eye, and even if he suddenly looked into them, he would immediately turn away, as if they were not to be looked into at all. It was as if he saw a ghost in them. This hurt and upset little Ioana very much. She really did not want to be alone. One day, she decided to catch up with her father to talk and ran after him. But suddenly, Eli came around the corner in the corridor. Little Ioana was running at full speed and cutting into her older brother so hard that she was thrown back to the floor. But as soon as she looked up to see who she was facing, she received a powerful kick to the face. Eli was furious and shouted at the girl, who had already warned him once to stay out of his sight. Besides, she had stained his shirt. Sitting on the floor with her hand on her battered face, Ilona began to apologize to her brother and ask him to forgive her. She could not stop shaking and was afraid to look up at her brother again. Eli just sputtered and added that she made him sick. And then he threw in the terrible words that it was because of her that their mother died. Some time later, Ioana was sitting on the edge of the bed in the maid's room. After Masa applied a compress and a plaster to her hostess's face, the devastated girl asked the woman a question. Doesn't Masa think that she is not a person at all, but just a ghost? Or perhaps she was an evil spirit who had killed her mother? The maid was amazed at the horrible thoughts that were in her little mistress's mind. The woman sat down next to the girl and began to comfort her. She explained that Eli was going through a transitional age, so he was so nervous. But there is no doubt that in the future he will become a wonderful viscount. And the owner himself had a wound in his heart that would heal someday, and then he would definitely look at his little girl. And there is no doubt about that either. After all, the young hostess looks very much like the late countess and is still very sweet. That in fact everyone loves her very much. But even then, very young Ioana did not believe the maid's words. It was evening and it was time for a family dinner at the estate. Everyone gathered at a large set table. His father's washed and dressed gift sat on a chair with everyone else. Eli asked the count unhappily if he was really going to eat with this slave at the same table. The count reminded Ilya that the higher his position, the more attention he should pay to those below him, and he advised him to pay attention to how well his old shirt fits on the young man. Ioana was sitting at the table right across from the young man. The girl noted to herself that the wounds on his face were much more serious than she thought. As a result, he would not even be able to eat anything. Suddenly, the young man's piercing gaze met Ioana's eyes again. The girl looked away and could not understand what was wrong with this guy. What kind of rude man dares to look so shamelessly into the eyes of a noblewoman? Then Eli turned his scrutinizing gaze to the young man. He asked the guy why he wasn't eating, and whether the uninvited guest was going to spit on all the kindness they were showing him. The young man tensed up. He looked at the plate in silence. Then he picked up the cutlery. And by the way, he picked up the knife correctly, namely, the knife to the right hand. And with trembling hands, he reached for the plate with the juicy steak with vegetables and garnish. Suddenly, Ioana asked him to wait a moment and took the plate of meat away. She replaced the guy's meal with a light and flavorful soup. Excitedly, the girl explained that he should eat it. She asked him if he seriously thought that he would dare to mock such expensive food, that he had no right to eat it at all. The guy was in shock. Ioana also froze in place, not knowing what else to say. All she could think was that she was an incredible fool. It was so unlike her. And anyway, why did she have to do all this? As the young man stared at John in confusion, she mentally asked the Lord to just start eating. After recovering from the shock, the boy picked up a spoon and began to eat the soup that was placed in front of him. When he started eating, Ioana breathed an incredible sigh of relief. She was worried that if the boy hadn't eaten anything, her brother wouldn't have left him alone, and she didn't want to see that happen. Eli, looking at his sister, said that she was rather stingy for a woman. Then Eli asked his father where he had picked up this boy and when. The count said that on the way home, a pitch-black fog descended on the land, and the coachman almost ran over someone on the road. When he got out of the carriage to see what had happened, he saw this beaten and exhausted guy on the ground. And then I noticed the slave mark on his hand. So he could not just leave such a young child on the road. Joanna was amazed at the nonsense her father was talking. He was probably just happy to get a slave for free. But looking at the Count's smug expression, the girl thought that she did not want to hate her father, but she did not know what to do when she saw something like that. Eli asked if his father thought the boy had deliberately jumped in front of the carriage. After all, many poor people try to get money from nobles for treatment in this way. This is also called staging. While Eli laughed, the stranger continued to eat his soup in silence. The Count replied that in any case, Eli should keep an eye on the boy. Although the young man did not seem to be able to speak, the man liked his eyes. That there is something of the parser nobility in this view. And who knows, maybe someday it will be useful. After these words, Eli, with a predatory smile, realized his father's plans. With that, the Count finished his dinner, took his leave, and went to rest. Eli, Ioana, and the new member of their family were left alone at the table. Silence fell. The young man calmly finished his soup, and Ioana was mentally glad that he had eaten. Eli looked intently at the couple at the table and came up with something. He defiantly raised his wineglass in his hand, and the next moment, the entire contents of the glass spilled onto the uninvited guest's head. The guy's face was in great shock. He was sitting all wet, and his face and new clothes were covered with red rivers. Eli laughed arrogantly and told his sister to look at the boy, because he looked like a soaked rat, and that now he did not look like a real nobleman at all. Ioana's blood ran cold. She did not expect her brother to treat the boy so cruelly right away. The young man silently wiped his face with his shirt sleeve. The girl could not comprehend that her brother found this behavior quite funny, even though he was a grown man. She thought her brother was just heartless. Eli got up from the table and said that his sister had a rather sluggish reaction to this situation. Didn't she find it funny? Just as the girl was about to object, her brother interrupted her again. Upset, he said that he thought his sister didn't like it, even though he just wanted to make her happy. And then, with a predatory smile, he added that he had a great idea, and he called Ioana over. The girl meekly got up from the table and approached her brother. Eli, taking his sister by the shoulders, turned her to face the young man and said that she was already 16 years old. Therefore, it was time for her to learn special methods of handling servants. Still standing behind Ioanina, Eli ordered her to kick the boy. Ioana was shocked, and her brother kept telling her to be brave, so she straightened her back, and then she did it. The boy watched this situation without taking his blood-red eyes off Ioana's. Eli whispered in her ear that she knew how to do it better than anyone else. At the same moment, she remembered a scene when Eli had kicked her in the face as a child. He continued to bait my sister like a dog. Eli told her not to hesitate and to hit the boy because people like him needed to be shown their place. The young man was still sitting silently and motionless on the chair, looking at his brother and sister. Ioana also looked at the boy and did not know what to do, and then she clenched her fists. After collecting herself, she slowly approached the young man. Approaching him as close as possible, the girl offered him something in a calm and quiet voice. She bent down to the young man and said she would pretend to hit him, and instead he should fall. She also asked him if he was willing. Another shock appeared on the young man's face. He certainly did not expect this. The next moment, Ioana lifted the hem of her skirt and quietly warned of a blow. And then, shouting insulting words about a stinking pig, she kicked the guy. The kick seemed to be so strong that he was knocked off his chair and onto the floor. Johanna was uncomfortable with how believably the boy imitated the blow and his fall. She thought he was going a little overboard here. For several minutes, the dining room was silent. The boy lay motionless on the floor. Ioana stood motionless near the chair, and Eli watched the scene with satisfaction. Eli's loud laughter broke the silence. He said that the girl was not as hopeless as he thought. Without hiding his admiration, the man added that he thought she had a lot of experience in such matters. Ioana, turning to her brother, only quietly added that this was true. The boy, who was still lying on the floor, was stealing glances at Ilya and John, and then, having no more strength, he closed his eyes and lost consciousness. Once upon a time in the Urzek Empire, there lived a young man named Etienne Bernhardt, the second son of Prince Bernhardt. He was a handsome boy, with warm blonde hair and extraordinary blood-red eyes. He had lived in prosperity and harmony all his life. But for him, this life seemed very boring and monotonous. Prince Bernhard had 4 children, 3 brothers and a sister, and they all got along well. No one ever objected to the fact that the eldest son would inherit the title of prince, as was customary, and no one ever organized a power struggle. One day, sitting on the windowsill, the prince's second son, Etienne, and third son, Edwin, were reading books. Suddenly, little Edwin asked his brother an unusual question. A little boy asked when his older brother fell in love for the first time. Such an unexpected question confused Etienne a bit, and Edwin explained that he thought he had met his love. He had seen blue eyes many times before, but this was the first time he had ever seen them like this. They were like the glitter of water reflecting the sky. Her hair was wavy like a stormy sea and shone with chestnut color. And if the forest fairy Smilax really existed, she would surely look like this. Etienne thought his little brother's confession was very sweet. He looked slyly at Edwin and asked if he had taken a liking to anyone from the recent feast. Edwin blushed and asked his brother not to tease him. Etienne smiled and patted the boy's head. It was one of the most wonderful, bright, and carefree days of his life. The next memory was of Etienne running somewhere at night through a dark forest. He was being persecuted. He could hear the pursuers on his heels. They echoed each other and described his appearance and clothes. Etienne was terrified and did not know what to do. He tried to understand how it all happened. The image of little Edwin still stood before his eyes, lying bloody on the floor, begging his older brother to run away as soon as possible. The last thing Edwin said was that it looked like their stepmother had put poison in the food. Etienne's face was terrified. He could not believe that all this was the work of their stepmother, that the death of his family and friends was because of a woman whom they accepted as their mother. With emptiness in his eyes and a quiet, weak voice, Edwin continued to urge his brother to run away and survive, that he had to survive. In shock, Etienne sat by the body of his younger brother and could not take his eyes off his bloody hands. The next moment, he woke up to the shouts of his pursuers, who continued to look for him. After hiding in the bushes for a moment, Etienne ran further into the depths of the forest. He kept running and running without looking back. At the same time, he blamed himself for his cowardice, for abandoning his home and family. He stopped only when the bright orange sun blinded his eyes. He realized that he was on the shore of the harbor. The boy walked up to the railing of the embankment and, catching his breath, looked at everything carefully. By the grace of fate, a ship headed for the Caspian Empire came into his field of vision. Etienne gradually started selling the things he had on him to buy everything he needed. He used his jacket to buy a boat ticket and the stolen family jewelry to buy bread and water. He spent several long months traveling to another continent. Upon arrival in Caspian, he changed the color of his hair with the help of a witch. Although he felt some relief that he had managed to escape, the thought that this was how he would spend the rest of his life was slowly gnawing at him from the inside. To survive, an aristocrat would take on any job, and as a slave, he would do whatever he was ordered to do. As long as he was mistaken for a slave with no relatives, his escape continued. And so, for a year, the second son of the famous prince gradually took on an increasingly miserable appearance in a country with which he had nothing in common. But now he was here in Ragwell. It was night, and silence enveloped the small stable behind the manor. It was in this building, on the hay, with the horses, that Etienne spent his first night. He was sick, but he could not move. The only thought in his head was that it was very cold here, and at this rate he might freeze to death. Suddenly, the door to the stables opened and creaked slightly. Someone went inside very quietly and approached the haystack on which Etienne was lying. He felt an unknown visitor approaching him and stretching out his hand. Etienne opened his blood-red eyes and jumped up. Rising up, he grabbed the hand of the uninvited guest, who turned out to be John, who had dropped the basket in which he had brought some bread and apples in fright. The surprised eyes of the boy and the girl met again. Etienne let go of Ioana's hand and couldn't understand what this young lady was doing here. He looked away and thought that she probably came to find out if he was still alive. Suddenly, Ioana picked up one of the apples that had fallen out of the basket from the floor, and she silently held it out to the young man, which once again surprised him. Etienne looked at her with incomprehension, and the thought flashed through his mind that she had really pissed him off. Then she looks away from him, as if she has seen some trash. She helps him, even though he did not ask her for sympathy. So how much longer will she treat him like trash? She was really annoying him. And this irritation began from their very first meeting. Etienne suddenly, sharply grabbed Ioana by the shoulders. The girl did not expect this. The next moment, the guy threw her to the ground and leaned over her, looking her straight in the eye. Ioana looked at Etienne with wide eyes filled with fear. And the guy said that she was very much mistaken if she thought he needed her pity. A few minutes later, the stable door opened and a frightened Ioana ran away. She was puzzled and did not understand what was wrong with this guy. Maybe he had lost his mind? After all, she came to save him, and he attacked her. Ioana thought that she shouldn't have helped him at all, that she was acting like a fool again when she felt sorry for the guy. Meanwhile, in the stables, Etienne lay on the floor with his arms outstretched, covered with the shawl that had been wrapped around Ioana. When he got up from the floor and freed himself from the shawl, the slap that Ioana had given him shone brightly on his cheek. Etienne thought he might have overdone it a little, but he decided not to worry about it. He reminded himself that he shouldn't give in to this false sincerity. After all, he himself knew exactly how it ended. Then something hit the guy's leg. It was another one of the scattered apples. Etienne picked it up and began to examine it very carefully. A few minutes later, he decided to take a bite. The next day, Count Eugenia's carriage was ready at the estate. The Count was leaving for a new journey to the Urzek Empire. In addition to Elijah and Johanna, Etienne also came to see him off. The Count said that the Emperor there was a little unwell, so he wants to see what's going on there personally. Moreover, the local aristocrats would also like to remind him of themselves. Then the Count turned his gaze to Etienne and said that he was completely unrecognizable, that he had grown quite handsome, and he noted that perhaps fate had brought him to Ragwell for a reason. The man asked the boy to obey Eli in everything, because he was, after all, a future count. The Count's words enraged Eli, and he looked at Etienne with contempt. From the expression on his face, one could tell that the young master simply hated this guy. Ioana also could not help but look at the young man with displeasure. She frowned at the fact that her father spoke more clearly to Etienne than to her, and she was really annoyed. After saying goodbye to the children, Count Eugenia got into his carriage and set off on a long journey. As he left, Eli ordered Ioana to return to the estate. Since he was going to Heibel, she should stay at home quietly. The girl agreed. After a few steps, Eli stopped as if he had forgotten something and turned to Etienne. He approached the boy with eyes filled with rage. And he said that he had something of his. And the next moment, Eli elbowed Etienne with all his might right in the head. Frightened, Ioana did not understand why her brother suddenly started beating the young man. Elijah told Etienne to listen to him carefully. He didn't need a pig like him as a servant. He added that the boy should remember well that every time he caught the young master's eye, he would be beaten by him. After that, Eli went about his business, and Etienne, holding his head, swam toward the stables. Ioana was on edge. She thought that after this Etienne would hate her for sure. After a while, Massa's maid served tea to a young lady who worked in her father's office. She asked the girl not to forget about rest and asked where the young master had gone again. Ioana replied that he was back in Heibel. Massa said she didn't understand how the future count could spend all his time playing games. After all, governance is the Viscount's job, and he dumps all the work on his sister. Ioana explained that running Ragwell is the responsibility of their entire family. Therefore, she cannot sit around and do nothing just because her brother is not at home. The maid smiled and thought to herself that in this her young lady was just like the late countess. Then Massa asked Ioana for help. She said she had to go away on business. Therefore, he asked the young mistress, if something happens, that she should never approach the slave with blood-red eyes. John felt a little embarrassed by these words. She asked the maid if anything had happened. Mesa got sterner and said that nothing had happened. It just gives her the creeps when this guy stares at her with his red eyes. This does not make him bad or evil, of course, but it is quite unpleasant. So the maid very insistently asked John not to look into those red eyes. On top of that, she reminded the young mistress not to forget the story of the bird of hell. With that, Massa left the office and left Ioana alone. Putting down the pen and taking in a lungful of air, the girl sighed heavily. She thought that if Massa knew what had happened last night, she would probably faint. The words of the maid about the slave who could not speak a word echoed in her mind. Suddenly, in her memory, she remembered Etienne, who had thrown her to the ground in the stables last night, leaning over her and telling her that she was very much mistaken. And then the girl froze. She strained to recall in detail all the events that had happened. Before her eyes were the boy's lips. Lips from which came such unpleasant words of pity. Then Joanna jumped up and slammed her hands on the table. She blushed when she finally realized that the boy could talk. The girl was furious, because it turned out that the young man had played everyone for a fool. How dare he play the master of all Ragwell for a fool? She decided to teach him a lesson and get back at him for yesterday's insult. Meanwhile, Etienne was away from the estate. He was grazing sheep on one of the hills overlooking the small town. The guy thought about how he was still dizzy, that the young owner turned out to be a scumbag. So it was better to be on the run than to be beaten every time. Has Etienne already thought that maybe he should just run away from here? Suddenly someone called out to him very loudly and angrily. He turned around and saw Ioannina approaching him. The girl looked furious. Holding her hat with her hand, she hurriedly climbed the hill. She shouted to the boy to stay where he was, and she would be right there. Etienne was puzzled. After all, he was usually told to come over, not the other way around. As she approached the boy, Ioannina shouted angrily that he should apologize immediately. Etienne looked at her and could not understand what was happening. The girl angrily noted that the boy could talk, which meant that he had deceived them all, that she had tried to help him and he had humiliated her. Ioannina broke up and could not calm down. She was screaming at how a slave could have such insolence. And Etienne, in response, just looked at the lady with an indifferent expression on his face. The girl was silent for a minute. She didn't like his look. She began to come closer to him and said that he would not be able to scare her with his look anymore. Although, in fact, she was scared. Suddenly, John's foot caught on a branch lying on a hill. The brave and angry young lady, who wanted to give the maids a hard time, fell to the ground with all her might. There was a silent scene. Etienne was taken aback, and Ioannina, in shock, did not move for several seconds. The boy was the first to decide to rectify this embarrassing situation, and gently asked Ioannina, who was lying on the ground, if she was okay. Red in the face with shame, the girl lay on the ground and could not believe that she had made a complete fool of herself. She wanted to get up quickly, but it seemed she hurt her ankle. It hurt so badly that she couldn't even move her leg. At first, Etienne, puzzled, just looked at the girl. Then he realized what had happened. His worried expression changed to irritation. He muttered something under his breath. Suddenly, Etienne's hand appeared in front of Ioannina, who was trying to get up from the ground. Looking up, she saw that the young man had crouched down in front of her and was stretching out his hand to help her climb on his back. Etienne looked at the young lady and felt a little embarrassed. At first, Ioannina didn't even understand what the guy wanted from her. It was hard for her to believe that someone like him was offering to climb on his back. It was hard for the lady to entrust her precious body to a slave. Moreover, she did not know what to do. What if someone saw them? Ioannina sat staring at the boy's back and could not decide to do anything. She looked at Etienne again. His expression was calm. He was waiting patiently. Ioannina realized that in any case, she had no other way. She wrapped her arms around Etienne's shoulders, sat up carefully, and leaned against him. He was surprised that the young lady decided to sit on his back so soon. Then he abruptly rose to his feet and made the young hostess comfortable on his back. Ioannina was amazed. She wondered how such a thin and seemingly frail boy could have so much strength. As Etienne carried the girl toward the estate, she kept thinking about what her brother would say. Something like that she was so pathetic for befriending a slave that she was disgracing the family. She was embarrassed to sit on my back, because she is not a child anymore. As they walked down the hill, Ioannina noted to herself that this guy smelled much better than she thought. It was getting dark outside, and the lights began to come on in Count Eugenia's estate. The maid Massa returned to the manor after finishing her work. As she was passing by the room of the mistress Ioannina, she overheard a conversation. The woman knocked on the door and looked into the young lady's room, asking who she was talking to. She saw a scene of a slave with blood-red eyes holding the leg of her young mistress with his hands. This shocked the old maid. She was very angry. Massa started shouting for the bachelor to take his hands off the young lady immediately. In fact, she asked what was going on here. Ioannina tried to calm her down and asked her not to shout like that. Etienne hurried to get away from the girl, but the maid kept shouting at him not to come near the mistress and called him a hellbird. Ioannina showed the maid her bandaged leg and explained that the boyfriend had just bandaged it. It was because she had injured her ankle while walking. The maid did not calm down. She asked if it had really happened while she was away, and whether the boy hadn't hurt her. After all, The lady had no idea how many servants offend noble daughters. Ioana kept trying to explain that Etienne had done nothing wrong and that the maid had just a very rich imagination. Suddenly, the girl stopped talking and asked herself if the guy had really done anything wrong. The next day, Etienne swept the yard near the stables where he spent the night. Ioana secretly spied on him, hiding behind a tree at a distance. Without looking away, she watched everything the boy did very closely. Etienne couldn't help but notice the lavishly dressed young lady behind the tree who was constantly staring at him. Looking down at Ioannis once more, their eyes met. But Etienne said nothing. He just sighed heavily and thought about what had happened this time. The girl came out from behind a tree and asked the boy why it was so hard for him to just say hello to her if they had already made eye contact. Ioana said that she had come to thank him. In fact, Ioana sincerely thanked Etienne for bandaging her leg. Thanks to this, it looks like it will heal very quickly. The guy was surprised, but didn't say anything in response. The girl felt embarrassed. She became irritated because it was very awkward when she was the only one talking. Then Ioana raised her finger up and warned him that she was about to tell him something important. The girl said that since she had come to thank him personally, it was his turn. Surely he doesn't think she has forgotten everything. Then, coming up close to Etienne, the young hostess asked him to his face how a worm like him dared to throw her to the floor. She pointed her finger directly at the guy's chest. Etienne was a little embarrassed and looked away from the young lady. He did not know what to say. Looking at the expression on the young man's face, Ioana could not understand what was wrong with him. She thought that the boy was finally afraid of her. She was very happy at this thought and told Etienne not to worry, that she hadn't told anyone about it. Otherwise, he would have been dead long ago. Although she thought to herself that if it became known that she, a noble lady, was meeting with a slave in the middle of the night, and a man at that. Joanna stood aside, thinking about the possible terrible consequences of her frivolous behavior. Etienne, watching her, thought about how he could get out of this situation. And he did come up with something. He carefully approached the young lady and bowed politely to her. And then, smiling slightly, he said that he apologized for his rudeness and called the girl his mistress. Ioana was stunned by the boy's unexpected politeness, and the next moment, when his words came to her, the girl's face flushed red. Ioana felt uncomfortable, so she started shouting at Etienne, something to the effect that this was the place to start. And in her mind, she tried to understand what had happened to make him call her mistress. After all, he had caused such a riot in the stables, and then suddenly such a change. After calming down a bit, Ioana added that she was not a vindictive person, and therefore, for the first time, she forgave the guy. But there would be no mercy the next time. But Etienne did not take her words seriously. The girl noticed this and asked the boy why he was making such a face. And then she said that it didn't matter, and that she would teach him a lesson herself. Etienne waited with interest to see what this strange girl was going to do. For a moment, she wondered what she could do with this guy. Her brother had said something about not wanting such a trash. And then she had what she thought was a brilliant idea. The lady announced that from that very day he would be her personal servant. That from now on, the boy should do everything she tells him without question. Etienne clearly did not expect this turn of events. He could not hide the obvious surprise on his face. And Ioana stood there smiling back at him. Then the girl abruptly grabbed the guy by the sleeve and pulled him along, telling him to follow her. She explained that she wanted to show him Ragwell. A few minutes later, they were standing on the riverbank watching a large waterfall falling from high cliffs in the middle of a dense forest. Then they went back to one of the hills, which offered a wonderful view of the city. The buildings were also buried in greenery among the trees and were separated by beautiful, neat streets. Then the couple went for a walk around the town to take a closer look at the pretty houses and small farms. At the end of the day, they climbed a high hill again to see a beautiful sunset. Watching the sunset, Ioana stole a glance at Etienne. He had a light and pleasant smile on his face, and it became clear that he enjoyed the walk. The girl looked closely and was surprised that this guy could do more than just frown. This also pleased her, and a smile appeared on the young hostess's face. When the sun went down, the couple set off for the estate. As they walked, Ioana mentally turned to her late mother. She told her that something incredible had recently happened to her. What their father brought with him from his trip to the capital was a slave. That this slave was a boy her age and had incredible blood-red eyes. Although the maid Masa forbids her to communicate with this young man because of his eerie eyes, which are so similar to those of a hellbird, but she still communicates because she is the mistress of all of Ragwell. Therefore, she intends to act on her own convictions. Everything in Ragwell belongs to her, so she has no reason to avoid a slave. While Ioana was sorting through her thoughts, they passed a large rose bush. The girl ran up to the flowers to pick one, but Etienne stopped her and explained that she should be careful not to prick herself. Then he turned around and walked to the lushly blooming roses. Ioana looked at him and realized that she had no reason to avoid the boy, and that was also because of that he would not hesitate to prick his fingers on the thorns of a rose if she asked him to. Etienne turned to his young mistress and, getting down on one knee, handed her one of the most beautiful roses. The next day, on a clear and sunny day, Ioana took Etienne for a walk again. She suggested that the boy organize a race and see which of them would reach the hill faster, and then she pointed the way to the hill she had in mind for the competition. When Etienne saw exactly where and how far his mistress was going to run, he felt uneasy. But there was no time to argue, because Ioana quickly started the countdown and shouted, "March!" and the couple rushed forward. While they were running, Etienne found it hard to believe that this girl was really going to run to that very distant hill. After a while, they both lay on the grass, exhausted, trying to catch their breath. After catching her breath, Ioana said that she had won. Etienne agreed without question. The guy thought to himself that he was no longer a slave, but a toy for fun. While the couple was resting on the grass, the sun was shining brightly and a pleasant fresh breeze was blowing. Then the girl raised her hand up and said that the sky in this place reaches the horizon. Etienne turned his head to Ioana to see her face. He noted to himself that this girl had extraordinary eyes, just like the clear blue sky. As Etienne looked at Ioanina, his ears turned red. The young man began to think about this young mistress. She was Ioana Eugenia, who was not even a little bit, but a very strange girl, in his opinion. At their first meeting in front of her father and older brother, the girl was quite modest. So he thought she was a soft-spoken person with a quiet character. But as it turned out, she's ready to run headlong, pulling up her skirt so that you can even see her knees. And she is not ashamed to do something that would make an ordinary noblewoman turn her nose up at. Her huge flow of ideas and energy filled everything around her, so much so that sometimes it was hard for him to cope with it and control the girl. One day, the couple was sitting in the library reading books. They were enthusiastically studying a book about animals and marveling at the diversity of fauna on Earth. Suddenly, Ioana heard the stomping and snorting of horses outside the window. She and Etienne looked out the window. There they saw a carriage that had just pulled up to the estate. Ioana's blood ran cold. Indescribable horror was written all over her face. She turned sharply to Etienne and shouted at him to hide immediately. She abruptly pulled the boy with her, and the familiar and angry voice of Eli began to echo through the mansion, calling out to the girl. Ioana pushed Etienne into a small closet in the library. When the angry voice of her brother, who was irritated that her sister hadn't even come out to greet him, came closer, the girl only managed to tell Etienne not to come out until she got home. Ioana quickly closed the door of the closet, and for a second there was complete silence. Sitting locked in a small room, Etienne heard the terrifying roar of Elijah screaming at his sister, and then the terrifying scream of Ioana, who had clearly been hit by her brother. Etienne reached out with a trembling hand for the door handle, but never dared to open it. He realized that in doing so he could harm Ioannis even more. Therefore, with a painful heart, he continued to sit quietly in the closet. Meanwhile, Eli calmed down a bit, and sitting in his chair, told John that he had heard a rumor that she had been getting along well with their slave lately. Therefore, he was not surprised that she smelled so bad. The girl was kneeling with her arms raised in the air, holding a pile of books, and her face was bruised and battered. Ioana carefully told her brother that the guy was just doing his job. And besides, he doesn't smell so bad anymore, since he takes a bath every day. And then she received another roaring kick, so that she would not dare to object to her brother anymore. Then Eli asked her why she was standing up for this guy. And has she fallen in love with him? Ioana was very frightened and began to shout back that nothing of the sort had happened. She swore by Saint Diana that she had done nothing shameful. Eli grabbed his sister's face and said that of course she hadn't done anything wrong. Otherwise, they would have been in big trouble. He leaned closer to the girl and said that her beautiful face was all that was left of their family, that he and she just needed to desperately look for marriage partners. Looking at his sister with cold eyes, Eli said that the only thing she could do for their family was to marry a wealthy nobleman from a noble family. Throwing Ioana to the floor, he emphasized that she had to remember this well. Then he ordered her to go to her room and practice something that noble women do, and to learn how to do makeup. While Eli continued to throw insulting words at his sister, Etienne sat quietly in the closet and could do nothing. The guy thought that he could not save his family, and now, having become a slave, he could not even protect his mistress. And if anyone is an idiot, it's him. The next day, Etienne was working near the stables when Ioana approached him. Her entire face was covered with plasters, but she still came to ask the guy to be her escort because she wanted to go for a walk. Etienne replied that he smelled like sweat, so she should stay away from him. The girl asked why he was saying that. She told him not to worry about what her brother said. Then she added that Etienne could just wash his face if he smelled bad, but she didn't care, so it wasn't necessary. In a slightly upset voice, Ioana said that no one ever comes to visit her anyway, so it doesn't matter if she smells or not. Etienne was surprised by this answer. He could not understand why he was still here. After all, every day he was thinking about getting away from here. The guy told the young lady that if this was her order, he had to obey. He would be her escort for a walk. Ioana was very happy to hear this answer. She said that it was unbearable boredom to sit in the mansion all day, and she added that she knew that the boy would pick a bouquet of roses for her again. As the couple carefree walked away from the stables, they didn't even notice that they were being followed. The man who spied on the young people was Joseph, Count Eugenia's personal servant. And apparently he did not do it with good intentions. Later that day, someone screamed in the estate's underground warehouse. It was Joseph who brought Joanna there and threw her into one of the storage rooms. The girl began to shout at the servant in anger. "What is he doing? Had he forgotten who she was?" With an indifferent expression on his face, Joseph replied that he sincerely apologized to the young lady, but his master's word was higher than hers. With that, the servant closed the door of the room, and the shocked John was left sitting on the floor among all kinds of unnecessary junk. So she was left alone in a damp and cold room that looked more like a prison cell. Eli stood at the window of the mansion and asked the maid Masa if she had heard his order well. He ordered John to be locked in the warehouse for 3 days and given only bread and water. Masa tried to object to the young master. She explained that it was extremely dangerous for the young lady's health. She asked him to have mercy on the girl. Suddenly, Eli sternly addressed the maid by name, which frightened her. He looked at the woman with his cold eyes and asked her in a creepy voice if she realized who the owner of Ragwell was. Where will she be able to go at her age if she is suddenly kicked out? And if she wants to help John, she should do what she is told. With that, Elijah sent the maid out of the room. Shocked and frightened, Masa stood motionless at the door. When she calmed down a bit, she realized that she was not alone in the corridor. Etienne was standing by the wall. When their eyes met, Masa became quite angry with the boy. The woman started screaming that it was all his fault, that it was because of him that her landlady was locked up. The maid grabbed the guy by the shoulders and started shaking him, repeating that it was all his fault. Suddenly, the woman stopped when she saw that Etienne was muttering to himself. The boy's eyes became empty and lifeless, and in his mumbling, Masa heard words in which he blamed himself for everything. The woman was amazed at how much this young man was also concerned about the fate of their young mistress, and that he was also having a hard time. She recalled how she had once scolded Ioana for talking to this hellbird and asked her to stop doing so because bad rumors could spread, to which Ioana always asked that the woman stop calling him that. After all, one could not judge a person by their clothes, and that he was a very nice boy in general. How the young mistress was excitedly telling her maid that the young man listened to everything she told him, and that he was always ready to play her silly games with her. And about how she sighed and said that she would be very happy if this guy was her real brother. When Masa returned to reality, she still couldn't understand why Ioana liked this creepy boy so much. But now was not the time for that. The woman let go of Etienne and said she had a request for him. Meanwhile, Ioana continued to be locked in the warehouse. There was nothing interesting around her, only old clothes and sodden slabs spread out on the cold fireplace. Her only entertainment was watching one ant roll a piece of food in front of her. Looking at the ant, the girl was amazed at how much perseverance there was in such a small creature. She made the assumption that the life of such a small ant is much more significant than her own. Suddenly, there was a loud rumble. It startled John to his senses. The girl began to get very nervous because she did not understand what was happening and what all this chatter was about. Meanwhile, the sound was getting louder and louder. Ioana jumped to her feet in fright. The girl realized that the sound was coming from somewhere below, from under one of the boards on the floor. She even suggested that it might be some kind of animal. As she approached the board from which the noise was coming, Ioana also thought that perhaps there was a passage under it. Just then, something black appeared from under the board and touched her hand. The stunned girl kept looking at her hand. She watched as someone's black hand touched her arm. Indescribable horror was written all over Ioana's face. She was so frightened that she fainted. As the young lady was about to give up her soul to God in fright, Etienne came out of the secret passage under the board. He did not immediately understand why the young mistress was in such a state. After a while, Ioana regained consciousness, but she had not yet recovered from the shock. She told Etienne that she had no idea there was a secret passage. The guy said that it was Masa who told him about it. She was very worried about the lady, so she asked him to visit her. Looking into the narrow and small passage, Joanna noted that Masa would not have been able to fit through. The girl even began to wonder if they had such a thing in their warehouse. Etienne, lowering his eyes, began to apologize to John. He said that from now on he would not be her servant. After these words, the girl's heart sank. She looked at the guy and asked him why he thought so. John began to speculate that maybe it was because she had done something wrong, or maybe he was just tired of following her around. Etienne firmly replied that it was not so, that the young lady was very kind to him. Then Ioana asked him again, what was the matter? The boy replied that it was because of him that she was in trouble now. Ioana got angry and started shouting that she was locked up here not because of him, but because of her brother. Etienne, looking into the girl's eyes, calmly replied that he was just a slave, that it is no longer acceptable for him to even speak to her in such a frivolous way. If there are vile rumors that the young mistress is very close to a slave of the other sex, the nobles and aristocrats will gladly pick up on this news and start shouting about it on every corner. Ioana looked at the boy in surprise and noted that he spoke so confidently about the behavior of the aristocracy, as if he knew it from his own experience. Etienne did not take the girl's words into account, but only noted that in any case he did not deserve such treatment from her, and he asked her to treat him like an ordinary slave from now on. Then Ioana asked irritably if her brother's word was more important to Etienne than hers? Or is she not enough of an aristocrat? Is that the reason he doesn't want to serve her? The guy started to object and wanted to explain that he didn't mean it at all, but the young hostess interrupted him. She said quietly that she had been thinking seriously about how wonderful it would be if he was really her real family. Etienne was shocked to the core by these words and by John's frankness, but he could not let his feelings get the better of him. So, with an indifferent expression on my face, I asked the young lady what kind of nonsense she was talking about. This made Joan very angry. She jumped to her feet and began to shout at Etienne that he was a real rude man and an arrogant and smug slave. Then the boy also got to his feet and offered his mistress to beat her insolent slave for such rudeness. And then, in a terrible voice and with empty eyes, he added that she should call him a dirty and cowardly slave. And she also told him to get out of her sight. Seeing such a crazy expression on Etienne's face and hearing such cruel words, Ioana was simply numb and could not say a word. After a minute, the girl regained her composure and was able to answer that she would not even think of doing such a thing. John asked her why she should tell him all this. Lowering his eyes, Etienne turned to his mistress again. But the girl didn't even let him finish. She screamed that she would not do it. She asked if the guy wanted her to stoop to the level of her brother. Etienne began to object, but Ioana did not calm down and asked him if he wanted her to behave like a real noblewoman, like her brother does. Does he want her to push and insult people? The girl clearly exclaimed that she would never do this. She doesn't see anything funny in all this abuse, that she is even disgusted to witness it, that she is very tired of all this. Ioana wanted to say something else, but suddenly froze. A terrible scene from her childhood reappeared in her memory, the first time Eli kicked her in the face. Then the girl lost her breath and started breathing heavily. At first, Etienne did not understand what was happening and why Ioana suddenly fell silent. And then I was very scared when I realized that she could not breathe because of a choking attack. The boy rushed to the girl and together, sitting on the floor, began to calm her down. He asked her to put her hand over her mouth and try to breathe through her nose. Gradually, Ioana began to calm down and her breathing steadied. Etienne kept telling her not to stop and to breathe deeply, slowly. He calmed the girl down with a calm voice, and in a few minutes she felt better and the seizure ended. Etienne sat with his arms around Ioana and began to apologize, saying that it was all his fault. He kept apologizing and apologizing, gently hugging the girl. Ioana thought about the fact that while at the manor, she had been suffering from chest pains, so this was not the first time she had sudden difficulty breathing. She thought it was funny that a slave who was constantly humiliated for his untidiness and constant stench actually smelled like dried leaves bathed in the rays of the spring sun. She had the impression that she was somewhere in the forest, and thanks to this, she finally managed to regain her breath. They continued to sit in an embrace for some time, until Etienne realized that the young hostess had fallen asleep in his arms. The blushing boy sighed heavily and thought about how it could have been different. He gently ran his hand over the sleeping girl's face. He mentally noted that it was very warm and soft. But then his fingers touched the bandages on her face that covered her recent wounds. Etienne's eyes turned bright blood red with rage. He thought it was unacceptable to lay a hand on such a defenseless child, and that only a real bastard would do such a thing. Deep night had fallen on the estate. Meanwhile, in the warehouse, Johanna was lying on the boards in a cold room, but she was covered with a blanket and turned away from Etienne. The guy handed her a loaf of bread and offered to eat. The girl just huffed in response and turned away again with puffed-out cheeks. Etienne said that if she didn't want to eat bread, she could at least drink water, to which Ioana reacted quite sharply and began to shout that she didn't need anything from him. And in general, who asked him to do all this if he wasn't even her slave? The boy calmly replied that he was a servant in this house, and if so, could he not take care of his mistress's health? To this, the irritated John said that he talked too much for someone who pretended to be mute. After all, she won't die if she doesn't eat, and she'll lose weight at the same time. At this point, Etienne's patience began to wear thin. He tried his best to contain his irritation. In the end, he was able to exhale and regain control of himself. The boy addressed the girl politely again. He remembered that his hostess had said that she would be very happy if they were a real family. So perhaps the young lady will agree to eat if she imagines that she is fulfilling the request of her second older brother. And Etienne's plan worked. Ioana jumped up to him and asked him why he was asking his older brother to do this. Etienne replied that he was 1 year older than the girl, and then Ioana was taken aback. She felt a little embarrassed by this discovery. She frowned again and said that she would not eat anyway, and that even water should not be offered to her. And then Etienne lost it. He started yelling. Why was she so stubborn? Of course, he understands that she doesn't like him, but that's no reason to refuse to eat. After all, it's very unhealthy. Frowning and ashamed, Ioana replied that this was not the case at all. Exhausted, Etienne, holding his aching head, asked, "What was the matter?" In a timid voice, the girl quietly replied that if she ate, something would happen. The boy did not understand the hint and asked what exactly was going to happen, and he received a clear answer that she would then want to use the restroom. That's when it finally dawned on the young man. Etienne thought for a moment and then looked around the warehouse, and not finding a more appropriate answer, he blurted out that the girl shouldn't worry about anything. He would clean up after her. Oh, the young mistress's shame and anger got the better of her. She turned to the guy and shouted with all the strength she had that this was exactly what she didn't want more than anything. Suddenly, the words stopped coming out of her mouth, because a loaf of bread blocked the way. While Ioana was screaming, Etienne, with a relaxed expression on his face, managed to get her to eat. And then he added with a sly smile that if she kept screaming like that, everyone would know he was here. Ioana had nothing to say to these words of the boyfriend. She called him a hack and told him that he pissed her off. And then, with tears of happiness in her eyes, she ate such an appetizing and delicious loaf of bread. Watching Ioana eat the bread with trembling hands, Etienne thought, and then I decided to ask how long it had been going on. Ioana turned to the boy and asked him what he meant. Etienne then asked her directly how long her brother had been treating her so horribly. The girl did not want to answer the question, but only said that it was none of his business. Etienne understood this answer and did not insist, but simply apologized. Ioana was a little sad, and then decided to change the subject. She told the guy that she had been thinking about something for a long time. The girl asked if the boy had a name, and if he didn't, could she name him? And then Etienne was dumbfounded again. The shock on his face could not be hidden. He asked his hostess what she was talking about, and John replied that since he was her older brother, she could not tickle her older brother. Then everything became clear to Etienne. He explained that he had only said that to make her eat. After all, someone like him would never be her big brother, not to mention the fact that a slave could have a name. And then, the boy's memory was filled with blurred images of his sister and brothers, who were smiling and calling his name so joyfully, and that terrible moment when his younger brother Edwin, in a barely audible voice, said his name for the last time. Etienne told Jonah that he had no right to have a name. Finishing the loaf, the girl said that he shouldn't have any rights to it, that any servant has a name. And then, she leaned over to the boy and asked him if he wanted to be called a hellbird for the rest of his life. Etienne laughed. Couldn't Ioana understand what she had said that was so funny? After calming down, Etienne reached out to wipe the breadcrumbs from the hostess's face. He replied that he just thought that if he had a sister like her, he would protect her very much. I would protect it as if it were the apple of my eye and the most precious treasure. Then the boy leaned closer to Ioana and whispered that he thought he would love a sister like that very much. And then he added that his name was Etienne, and only the two of them knew about it. Several days passed, and Ioana was finally released from the lockup. But because she had been in the underground warehouse for 3 days, she developed a high fever and was in pain all over. After spending some time in bed, the girl finally regained consciousness. And when she opened her eyes, she found a beautiful red rose next to her pillow. Looking at the flower, Ioana realized that only one person could have brought it here. The next day, Etienne stood timidly in front of his landlady's room. Finally making up his mind, he quietly went inside. Etienne went to the bed where Ioana was still resting. The guy quietly put a red rose near her pillow. Blushing, he turned around and decided not to stay in the room, so as not to cause trouble again. Suddenly, someone grabbed his arm and stopped him. Behind him, he heard a pleasant and familiar voice condemning him for daring to sneak into the girl's room as shamelessly as he did. So Ioana decided to catch Etienne red-handed. He was so surprised that he didn't even know what to say. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she shared with Etienne that she had long been used to her brother's abuse. After all, sooner or later, the pain would go away. Without letting go of the guy's hand, she added that now, something told her that without him, this loneliness of hers would last forever. That's why she asked him to never leave her alone. Etienne grabbed the girl's hand with both of his hands. He knelt down in front of her and said that he would never dare to go against her will. Ioana was happy. It seemed to be one of the most joyful days of her life. Since then, Etienne has not left her for a minute, even when winter gave way to summer, and then summer gave way to winter again. Until the lush roses bloomed again, he always stayed by my side. A year has passed since then, and then one day, Ioana, who had turned into a graceful young woman, sternly asked Etienne if he was really turning 18. Etienne, on the other hand, had matured during this time and had grown noticeably. His shoulders became so broad that a girl could easily hide behind them. But this did not help him understand why Ioana was so interested in his age. Ioana approached the guy and said that it all looked suspicious, that in just 1 year, he had stretched all the way to the ceiling. And the first time they met, she didn't have to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. Etienne was embarrassed, and Ioana added, smiling, that no one cares about his age. After all, none of this will change the fact that he is her family. But at the same time, he should not forget about his official duties. Etienne agreed with his mistress and said that he would never forget it, and that he would be extremely happy if she continued to treat him as she has been treating him up to now. And then Ioana asked if he was really that happy, which confused the guy. He didn't understand her question, and the young lady asked him if he really liked being around her. Etienne was shocked by such a frank and direct question. He stared at Ioana in silence, but then his gaze dropped to her lips and then moved to the girl's rather beautiful and attractive neckline, which had rounded off quite noticeably over the previous year. His mind was blurred. He blushed all over and felt very ashamed. The next moment, Etienne turned around and slammed his head against the wall with all his might to regain consciousness. This time, it was Ioana who was shocked. She shouted out in horror, "What is this guy doing?" And then Etienne came to his senses. He didn't understand why he had started doing this, and when he straightened up, the young mistress panicked because the dog was bleeding from the head. Some time later, Etienne, already with his head bandaged, stood in Count Eugenia's room. The Count also noticed that the boy had grown quite a bit since he had last seen him. Etienne politely replied that it was all thanks to the Count. The owner of the estate told the young man that Joseph had told him that the boy had spoken, although at first he found it hard to believe. The Count looked intently at the boy and thought that from the very moment he brought this young man home, he had been haunted by a certain feeling. It's a strange feeling that this guy has some dignity. The kind of dignity that you can't hide, no matter how hard you try. Then, Count Eugene said that he wanted to ask the young man something. The man specified that the boy should know about his journey to the Ursky Empire. He said that there was a big commotion there because of the disappearance of a boy. And then Etienne's heart sank. The Count went on to say that people say that if that boy were still alive, he would have been the same age as the young man. And then Count Eugene asked if the boy had ever heard of Prince Bernhard. Etienne clenched his fists and tried to keep himself in check. With an indifferent expression on his face, he told the Count that he was not a citizen of Urzicek, that he was only a convicted slave from birth and had never heard of what his master was talking about. Looking directly into the Count's eyes, the boy said that he was very sorry, but he could not help him. Hearing this answer, the Count only smiled and then added that, in any case, the people of that empire were looking for a blond boy with blood-red eyes. So he asked Etienne to forget what he had said. He only added that he liked the guy and that he could continue to work for his family. After leaving the Count's room, Etienne could barely walk down the corridor, holding back his trembling. He could not believe that he was still wanted, and that an entire empire had already been raised to search for him. His stepmother, Katrina Bernhardt, was the woman who killed his brothers, sister, and father, all in order to make her own son the heir. Now that his family was no longer there, Etienne could no longer call that place home. Suddenly, the boy stopped at a window that led to another room. Through it, he could hear the teacher teaching someone how a real noblewoman should walk, how long her skirt should be. Looking closely, Etienne saw Ioana in the room, being trained in courtly etiquette. After all, the young mistress would soon have to go out into society. The girl looked exhausted, and without words, it was clear that she did not like this kind of training at all. Looking at his mistress, Etienne thought that this woman should not dare to upset his mistress. After all, he himself was sick of all these Bernhardts and Eugenies. He stood there for a few more seconds and watched the girl being murdered, and then the words came out of his mouth. He asked his mistress not to worry, because he did not care about that princely title, and with a certain madness in his eyes, the guy added that she was his only family, and he would always be there for her. Later that day, when Etienne had finished his business at the estate, he returned to the stables. There was an unexpected surprise waiting for him there. Ioana was sitting on the haystack where he was sleeping on the mattress, hugging the pillow. The guy asked what his hostess was doing here. He said that this was his bedroom and asked the girl to leave. Ioana replied that she was the one who gave him these things, so she had every right to sit here. She told Etienne that few people in the residence knew about it, but she thought her brother had invited some entrepreneur to open a ball in honor of her debut. And so it became clear where he got the money for such a lavish event. Etienne asked if her brother hadn't returned yet. Ioana replied irritably that the boy knew very well how rarely his brother was home. She suspected that he had another villa in Heibel, and regardless of whether or not he had another villa there, Ioana was glad that her older brother was often away. Meanwhile, the large and magnificent city of Heibel, lined with beautiful stone houses and paved streets, was covered by a downpour. In one of the small houses at the crossroads, joyful words of a long-awaited meeting were heard. A beautiful young lady with long silver hair and purple eyes greeted Mr. Eli with delight. She was Elizabeth Denmarie, and she was Eli's beloved Eugenia. She ran to meet her lover and fell into his arms. Ilya greeted her tenderly and said that he had asked her to contact him if she was in Heibel. He asked if she was waiting for him. Elizabeth explained that at home she would have had to listen to her father's endless lectures. He would only talk about her lover's vices, gambling, debt, and other nonsense. She could not stand it. Eli replied that he was immensely grateful for her trust, but he had to admit that he understood the Marquise's feelings. After all, to know that his only daughter was wasting her precious time with a peasant like him. The girl vehemently objected, saying that Eli was not a peasant at all. Moreover, she was also a noblewoman, but she was very tired of it all. While Mrs. Elizabeth was confessing to Elijah that being with her beloved would be enough to make her happy, Someone was watching this romantic scene. This someone was a maid with short red hair who was standing outside the door of the next room and who was secretly laughing at the young girl's sincere confession. Elizabeth Demery was the only daughter of the Marquis of the Caspian Empire. She met Eli for the first time a year ago at a ball organized by Demery's family. Such a handsome and elegant guy, he introduced himself to the young lady and asked her to dance. He was so polite and gallant that Miss Elizabeth could not even think that men of such unprecedented beauty walked the earth. As they danced dance after dance together, Elizabeth could not take her eyes off this young man. As if under a spell, she was increasingly attracted to this handsome man, and she prepared a small house for them to enjoy their secret meetings there. However, only a naive girl believed that it was fate. Another maid joined the conversation between Mrs. Elizabeth and Eli, but she did not mock the secret meeting of the lovers. She was Miss Elizabeth's maid and was very worried about her. A little later, Eli got into a carriage and left the house of secret meetings with Mrs. Elizabeth. A red-haired maid was waiting for him in the carriage, and she noticed that Mr. Eli was very tired today. The man replied that playing love with this girl was really exhausting him. Eli said that it would be much better if the young lady was as responsive as his assistant. The girl laughed and said that her master was spoiling her. The maid noticed that the noblewoman was just crazy about him, and that everything else was just a matter of time. That in the end, the Marquis de Marie would give in to his daughter's selfishness. Eli added that if he got to the de Marie family's fortune, he would finally get rid of that shabby mansion in Ragwell and build a beautiful villa in Highbull. And then he would give the girl a precious stone. With that, the man embraced the maid and held her close. The girl hastened to say that she was certainly pleased to hear such words from the gentleman, but more than anything else she wanted him to become a count or even a marquis as soon as possible. Smiling back and putting his hand under the girl's skirt, Eli added that she loved to flatter him. So this insidious couple continued their journey in the carriage in the pouring rain. At this time, in a secret house, another maid tried to comfort her grieving mistress, who did not stop shedding tears. Elizabeth was crying because Eli had not kissed her again. The maid reminded her that the Viscount had sworn that he would not touch her until their relationship was publicly announced and all formalities were observed. This is exactly what Elizabeth noted from the maid's words. After all, unlike the others, this man is a true gentleman. To top it all off, the girl was upset that her father was the kind of person who even rejected the offer of the famous Count Noah. Therefore, he would never allow her to be with Mr. Elia. The maid reminded her that there were all sorts of bad rumors about Mr. Noah, and it was a good thing that her father had rejected his proposal. Elizabeth replied irritably that she was grateful to her father for that alone. But she didn't think Eli was like that. Count Yevgeny may not be very wealthy now, but he is known to everyone as a serious entrepreneur. Mrs. Elizabeth asked the maid if she could tell her if there was a single man in the world whom her father would recognize. What would she do if she spent the rest of her life as a family doll? Elizabeth desperately wanted to escape this fate as soon as possible. Meanwhile, a bouquet of beautiful white lilies was sent to Count Eugenia's estate for Mistress Ioana. The girl was very surprised to receive such a gift from Highbull. She asked the maid if it was really for her. Massa confirmed that it was true. Only this bouquet was sent anonymously, so it was not known from whom it came. The woman asked the hostess if it could be the young master or even the count himself. John asked the maid if she believed what she was saying. She remained silent, knowing that her words could hardly be true. Massa raised her finger and exclaimed that she knew the answer. She believed that it was some gentleman who had fallen in love at first sight with the portrait of the hostess that the young master had recently prepared for the announcement of the ball. The girl was suspicious of this explanation. She said that she doubted it was because of an unnamed portrait the size of a palm, that it could not be. While the maid was trying to convince Joanna that this was possible, since the mistress had no friends from Highbull, Etienne overheard the conversation. He had been in the corridor outside the door for some time, so he overheard John's conversation with the maid. Etienne thought that maybe one miserable rose, against a luxurious bouquet of white lilies. The guy realized that this bastard Eli was in a big hurry. When Etienne was helping with the household chores at the estate, he overheard other servants gossiping that the owner of Eli owed Count Noah a whole lot of money, and that Mr. Noah had taken care of all the expenses for the ball. According to the servants, it was too much for the young Master Elijah to sell his own sister to pay off his debt. That in terms of such heartlessness, Mr. Noah was not worth a fingernail compared to Mr. Elijah. And also that this was not a ball in honor of Ms. Iwana's debut at all, but a real deal called a wedding. The name of Count Noah stuck in Etienne's head. He kept trying to remember who this count was. And then it was as if he was struck by lightning. Is this the same Pierre Noah? Count Noah of Caspian? Etienne remembers how one day he regained consciousness in a warehouse. He was dizzy and his right arm hurt a lot. When he examined his arm, the guy did not understand what had happened and how he had gotten the wound. After taking a closer look, he assumed that it was a brand, that such marks are carved with magic and are not so easy to get rid of. Suddenly, Etienne heard a conversation. One man was complaining to the other about someone named Noah, that this Noah had screwed up his marriage and decided to take it out on them, that the gentleman was naive to believe that all his behind-the-scenes activities would never come to light. The second man advised him to keep his mouth shut. After all, if Noah found out about their conversation, he would sell them both out. The first man complained that they had nothing to fear and that Noah had betrayed them, so they could tell on him. As an accidental witness to this conversation, Etienne began to recall that he had heard Noah's name somewhere before. He recalled reading about Count Pierre Noah, who was a newly minted entrepreneur from Caspian who became rich from the slave trade and the sale of illegal drugs. Despite the rumors about him, there was no actual evidence of his involvement in all this, so it was impossible to bring him to justice. Back then, Etienne was warned about the count by one of his relatives, but at that moment, the boy returned from his memories to a dark, unfamiliar warehouse. These were painful memories from his past that shook his mind and heart again. At that moment, he saw no sense in life. In the afternoon, on the shore of a lake near the estate, Ioana tried to learn a dance, and her partner was Etienne. The girl's face was tense because she was fully concentrating on her movements, her feet, and kept counting her steps so as not to stumble.
Then Ioana asked how Etienne knew how to dance at the ball.
The guy coldly replied that he had seen the aristocracy dance at balls many times before, so he knew. The girl did not like this answer. She asked if he was taking her for a fool. After all, one cannot achieve such skill in dancing by observation alone. Then Ioana said that she shared her hunch with Etienne. Though she thought her idea would sound crazy, she thought he would. Then the guy did not let her finish and abruptly pressed her to him by the waist. Thus, he confused the girl. Looking into the girl's eyes, Etienne said that she should focus on dancing, not on idle chatter. After all, this was the 5th time she had stepped on his foot. Ioana was really surprised by this unexpected pirouette, and when she looked at the face of the Hedian, who was smiling gently at her, all her thoughts flew out of her head, and she forgot what she wanted to say. Then the girl blushed. She didn't understand what was wrong with her, because she used to feel confident around Etienne. When they went to the forest together, holding hands, when she was frightened of a snake, she hugged him tightly, and now she could not find a place for herself. She had always guessed that he was... And Johanna's thoughts left her head again as she looked at his lips. She was so mesmerized that she didn't even hear Etienne speak to her. When she came to, she accidentally stepped on the guy's foot again. The girl began to apologize very much, and Etienne said that everything was fine and she shouldn't worry so much. But Ioana was worried that she had hurt him, especially since it was not the first time. Then she moved a little away from the guy and turned away. Etienne hastened to reassure his hostess that he was really not in pain. But that wasn't what worried Johanna. She was more concerned about the ball, which was the first in Ragwell since her mother's death. And she danced like a chicken. She's scared at the thought of being embarrassed in front of her family. Etienne put his hand on the girl's shoulder and turned her around, saying that he thought her dancing skills were not that important. Johanna did not understand how dancing could be unimportant at a ball. Then, Etienne took in a lungful of air, gathered his courage, and told the young hostess something unexpected. With a serious expression on his face, the guy looked her straight in the eye and told her that she was very nice. Ioana instantly blushed. She was shocked by this confession. While the girl was trying to find the right words, Etienne blushed a little too. Then he leaned down and gently took Ioana's hand and kissed it. He asked her if she really thought there would be a single man at the ball whose mind would be occupied only by her dancing skills, not about holding the hand of a beautiful creature like her. These words made Ioana even more flushed. The girl said that this would not happen. In fact, she is sure that everyone will judge her harshly, no matter who is standing in front of them. Etienne corrected the hostess, saying that she would actually be the judge because the ball was in her honor. And whether it is good, appropriate, dangerous, or something else, only she can judge. Ioana calmed down a bit and said that she was impressed with Etienne, that despite his being a slave, she never noticed the fear that characterizes slaves. And then, abruptly approaching the guy, she added that he was the greatest danger to her. After all, he could read, he could dance, and he was generally an example of the upbringing of her father and brother combined. So, looking Etienne straight in the eye, Ioana asked him who he was. For a moment, the guy was frozen with surprise. He didn't know what to say, and for a few seconds, he just stared into the abyss of Ioana's blue eyes. And Ioana pressed her nose into his chest and said that he didn't have to answer. After all, he would deceive her again, wouldn't he? Etienne looked at the girl and hugged her tightly. The guy said he would tell her everything someday. Johanna asked if he promised her that. Etienne said that he did, because he was anxious to tell her, that he also wants to be free of this burden. The day of the ball came. The maid Masa came to the young mistress's room and asked if she was ready. Without looking up, Ioana answered uncertainly that she did. Holding their elder brother's hand, they walked together to the lavishly decorated terrace, where a huge number of nobles and aristocrats had gathered. The ladies attending the ball were delighted with Viscount Eugene. As always, he radiated beauty and elegance. And then they noticed and could not believe that the young lady next to him was his younger sister. An incredibly beautiful girl with long wavy brown hair and eyes the color of the sky. She was dressed in a luxurious blue and white dress, adorned with a pearl necklace and earrings, and had white gemstone flowers on her head, which further emphasized the extraordinary color of her eyes. Eli did not miss the opportunity to give his sister a warning that if she ruined her reputation even once, she would never get it back. Ioana replied that she understood. As the brother and sister stood in the middle of the terrace, someone loudly said that the rumors were true, that Count Eugenia's daughter was really beautiful. They were approached by a young man who said that it would be an honor for him to finally meet the Count's daughter in person. He introduced himself as Pierre Noah and asked Ioana not to refuse him the first dance. Ioana kept her eyes on the boy for several seconds. He was a tall, slender young man with short silver hair and the same gray eyes. Eli joined the conversation and greeted Count Noah and thanked him for his visit. He also reminded his sister of her manners and that she should also greet the Count. Eli said that Count Noah is a man who is known not only in Caspian, but also far beyond its borders. And then, with a satisfied smile on his face, his brother added that, on top of everything else, this young man was her fiancé. This unexpected news made Ioana freeze in her tracks.